Hello and welcome back to the completely fantastic way of studying for your exam, especially as this is about China under Mao Zedong from 1949 to 1976. Welcome back. Hope you're sticking with these videos. I know I'm having a whale of a time making them. Boy, I can tell you. Beats going out on a bank holiday Sunday night. But we'll get straight into it. And obviously, or I say obviously, if you haven't seen the first video, which discusses question 1 of Unit 1, then I'd advise you to look at that first before moving on to this one. But we're going to try and shoot through what needs to be said. Here we go. As I said, in the first video, we look at question 1A, 1B, and 1C. In this video, we are now going to look at question 2A, to be or not to be. And finally, question 2C. Please note that these are staggered, or tiered rather. 4 marks for the first question in question 2, or the first sub-question. 6 marks for the second subsection, and 10 marks for the third subsection. Okay? Let's move on. Before we begin, again, I cannot stress enough the importance of understanding that question, okay? I've used the word decoding it, and you can decode a question by looking out for those command words, okay? If we just go over these once more, to explain is to provide a number of reasons showing how or why each of these reasons contributed to the named event in question. Secondly, is to describe this. This will require you to go into more specific factual detail, kind of getting things under the microscope there, even though it's not analysis as such, but you need to know, you need to be aware that you have to add as much as you can write on a certain fact that you're coming across, okay? And then the final type of question will be more of, it's asking you to come up with a judgment, okay? And it also wants you to give an evaluation, okay? How successful, a balanced answer to the question is required there, okay? But it really wants you to come down at the end, rather than sitting on a fence, as they would say. It wants you to come down and say, I think that the land reforms that Mao attempted were not very successful. Maybe in the beginning, but at the end they weren't, okay? So we'll move on, and you can see a lot of examples of these questions, and certainly of the answers of how to tackle these questions as we go through this video. Okay, so question 2A. As you get the format, if you've seen the first video, this question will begin with describe. Describe the, and then it'll fill in something. So it'll be something about the period of 1949 to 1976 of Mao's China, okay? So it's a deployment of knowledge of a historical event or a feature is what we are asking you to kind of what the body of that question is, or the reason. And this is a descriptive question and requires a descriptive answer, okay? So we want you to describe things, and this question demands own knowledge only. You are not going to be given a source for this one, okay? So you are out there on your own. Now, it's not a bad thing, so don't panic about it. Because it would have been something that he would have been taught in class, and it'll be something that I'm sure you would be kind of familiar with if you've done your revision. Sorry about that. So moving on. The example that I've got from the specimen paper is describe Mao's attempts at land reform, and this is worth 4 marks. Okay. Now, again, there is no source, so can you describe what Mao attempted to do in his land reforms? Well, let's go and have a look at the answer that I wrote. because as I said, I took this test myself. So I wrote that Mao wanted to divide the land of China between the peasants. He wanted to give land to the landless peasants. There was a law passed called the Agrarian Reform Law. Mao sent cadres into villages to teach the poor peasants how to work out the class of everyone in the community. Landlords would be put in front of poor peasants and put under trial at people's courts. If the landlord was found guilty of treating his people badly, then land would be taken from him. This was often the case. Usually violence was used against the landlords, and many landlords were executed. Historians say that perhaps 4 million landlords were killed. After the peasants had the land given to them, many were disappointed as they did not have any equipment to work on the land, and they did not have any money to buy this equipment. To make the best of this situation, many peasants worked together in mutual aid teams. This meant they shared their land, their animals, and their equipment. Later, in the 5-year plan, the government made peasants work in cooperative farms. The peasants had to give their land to the cooperative and became landless again. When the Great Leap Forward happened, the peasants were then made to work in communes. The peasants' lives became worse in these communes. Okay, so it's a 4-mark question, so you wouldn't be expected to write probably as much as I have, okay, but I'm hoping, because they've said describe, I would advise that you would need to get in certain buzzwords to show that you know, or at least prove that to the person who's marking your paper that you know what you're talking about. So an important one here is there was a law passed called the Agrarian Reform Law. Okay, there was also cadres were sent into the villages. Yeah, we can also see the word here, people, or the words rather, people's courts. Okay, if we come further down, mentioning a statistic there, 4 million landlords were killed. That shows knowledge, your own knowledge. Yeah. If I go further down, mentioning the first 5-year plan in the correct order, mentioning cooperative farms, mention the first 5-year plan in the correct order, and then mentioning the cooperative farms and then the communes, show that I know what I am talking about, and I've structured it that way. Okay, hopefully that question will come up in some shape or form, and if you're listening to this, or even if you've read that, there's a good sort of structured way of writing a top answer, I would say. Yeah, I would say that. Okay, so moving on. I hope that helps. Hints for question 2A. Let's give you some of the key facts that you can actually remember. What you have to do if when the question comes up, you must identify and describe at least 2 or 3 features. Okay, which I believe I have done there in the past question, and only include information that is directly relevant. Okay, try not to go off on a tangent. Okay, when I'm writing, I don't do it. When I talk, I do. But when I am writing, believe it or not, I know that structure is very, very important, and you're just going to waste your time, your ink, and your effort by talking about something which is not involved in land reform, or Mao's attempt at land reform. Okay, so there's pointless mentioning the Cultural Revolution, it's pointless mentioning the Long March, it's pointless mentioning the moderates. Okay, so in general terms, and it says to avoid being general, but be specific, avoiding generalized comments. Okay, stick to a path, mention only what you know. And of course, a little tip here is, as soon as you see that question, jot down a few things. Boom. What do I know about land reform? Well, I know that it was given from the landlords to the peasants, and cadres were brought in, and there was the people's courts, and then you can go back to this list of words that you have, which would be your key features there, and you can put those in order as you write. Okay, so just don't be scared of that question just because there is not a source in front of you. Okay, let's move on. So the question is, to be or not to be? That is the question. I've been trying to get that in all the way through these videos, but that will begin with, why was source F produced in? Now this is a really, really good and interesting question from a historian's point of view. it's, if you ask me, it's one of the most interesting ones because you kind of, you have to know your stuff, but you can get so much out of it. For instance, I could write so much on this, and I think when I was looking at the Germany one, the question that they've got in there is revolving around the Holocaust. So I think when they're going to give you this source, okay, it's going to be of relevance. It's going to be one of the big things there, right? I've got a suspicion. I can't say that for sure, but I've got a suspicion. You'll see what I mean now. The purpose of this question is to find out why, or not necessarily the origin. They will give you the origin, but it says it there. The purpose of the creation of a primary source. What was it used for? When? And it's important to have a look at the timelines here. And I'll show you if we move on. You need to place this singular source. So when they give you this source, you need to place that source, whatever it is, newspaper article, in the Germany in transition. It's a painting from a Holocaust survivor. It could be a poster, which I know the ending to this one. It is with what I'm using. But what you need to do, you need to take that source, whether it's a speech, okay, and you need to think about everything you've learnt about Mao's China. And you need to go, aha, this is the jigsaw, and that's the little hole where that goes there. It goes before that, and it goes after that. So what is going on, and why was this produced? Okay, so I think the best thing to do is we will move on. And there is no need to evaluate the source. We're not asking for that. We need really stick to the question, why was source F produced in? Okay, it's not asking, was source F useful? Is source F important? No, why? Why was source F produced in? Okay. So why was this poster issued during the Great Leap Forward? Okay, this is worth 6 marks. I hope you can see it on here. You will be able to see it on your papers. One thing I have noticed, it looks a lot better in colour than it does in black and white. It brings out a lot of detail here. Okay, but it's a poster issued by the Chinese Communist Party during the Great Leap Forward in 1960. Okay, so let's just go into there. We can. I think the answer will sort of reveal what I saw in the poster, and I did write quite a bit on this. Okay, it is a 6-mark question. Perhaps I did do a bit of overkill here, but all of these are great points, and you never know by listening to this and reading this. Something might come up about the Great Leap Forward for an essay question. There's a lot of points you can take from there. Okay, so this poster was issued during the Great Leap Forward by the Chinese Communist Party. I've only just copied what it's told me, okay, but it's a great start. Mao wanted to make China into one of the world's leading industrial nations, while at the same time improving its agriculture, okay, its farming. Mao did not believe that he needed machines and technology to accomplish this. He thought that if all Chinese people worked together and worked hard, they could make a great leap forward. Okay, this poster was used as propaganda by the Chinese government to urge the people of China to work hard. At the bottom of the poster, we can see a group of people all working together, and they look happy and well dressed. But I know that this was not really what happened. Although many peasants worked very hard, they were starving, miserable, and treated badly. Boy, were they treated badly. And also, in the poster, there is a man holding up steel with a ribbon around it. This could be like a second paragraph. Again, I feel I've written a little bit too much for this, but all good stuff. So also in the poster, there is a man holding up steel with a ribbon around it. This shows that people were asked to make good steel. The man has a pair of goggles and could be an engineer. But I know that Russia had to teach China how to make good steel. And after this, Mao made the communes contribute to the Great Leap Forward by setting up backyard steel furnaces all over China. A lot of steel was produced, but it was of very poor quality because the workers were not taught properly. The steel would split when heated. Also, there were a lot of accidents in factories because people were overworked and things were rushed. Sorry, that like when I was taking the exam, I kind of timed myself, so I'm sorry if I've copied this. As well as this, people were made to work in the backyard steel campaign and could not work on the land. This meant that people could not make enough food to eat. Okay. The Great Leap Forward intended to solve the problem with too little food in China. Next to the engineer in the poster, there is a woman carrying a bundle of corn, but this did not happen. The Great Leap Forward also failed when it came to farming. Methods of farming were terrible. For example, the peasants were told to plant many seeds close together so that bigger crops would grow, but this did not work and the crops suffocated themselves. The leaders of the communal farms had to meet a quota of food that was given to the rest of China or they would be in trouble. The peasants ended up giving nearly all of their food because so little food was made. This caused a huge famine and around 20 million Chinese people died. Okay, so hints for that question. Let's go back a second there. Okay, so basically, this poster was used as propaganda by the Chinese government to urge the people of China to work hard. Okay, and you can see it is giving examples of that. Okay. And also, it is adding your own knowledge. You are saying what you see in that source, right? And I suppose at the end of that, it wouldn't do any harm to re-emphasize. So, as you can see, this poster does not provide a true picture of what was happening or taking place during the Great Leap Forward. Okay? Now, let's have a look at the hints for that question. You must refer to the content of the source and explain what it shows. Candidates are well advised to concentrate on the date so they can show evidence that they know what was taking place at that time and why the piece was produced. Okay. Now, as I have mentioned in my answer, it does show that I'm aware of what took place, but after the Great Leap Forward, there were 3 years of famine, 3 years of misery. Okay. So, again, I feel, looking at my answer now, because I'm being honest with you, I feel perhaps I should have, perhaps at the end, made more of a point of pointing out why it was produced to get the Chinese people working for the Great Leap Forward. Okay? But again, it is set during the time of the Great Leap Forward, so they wanted to present a picture of everybody else in China working hard and you should be doing it as well. Okay, that kind of idea. Okay, so another hint here is use your knowledge to say what was happening at the time the source was produced. So I feel I've written maybe too much around there for a 6-mark question, but I've certainly got a lot of points in there. If there was one thing I would change, I would probably emphasize that it was more for the propaganda use and to get more Chinese people to work and urge them to work very, very hard. Okay, whilst painting the picture of false steel being made, and instead of an abundance of corn being made, the people were starving. Okay, so if we move on, and you must make use of the attribution, as this can help to identify motive and help explain why the source was produced at that time. Well, in my answer, I do say that it was produced by the Chinese Communist government, and the motive is to urge the Chinese people to work harder. Okay, so we will move on to question 2C. Now, this one, a few people have mentioned to me, oh, this looks really, really difficult. I never used the word difficult. It's certainly, at first glance, before you're given the technique, it could be labelled as being challenging, but I certainly wouldn't say difficult. Okay. Okay. This is a question. It will begin with one interpretation is that. Boom, 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 boom. It will tell you an interpretation of a certain event in Mao's China, okay? And then it will say, how far do you agree with this interpretation? Now, interpretation is simply a person's viewpoint, how they have read things. Historians have interpretations, and the more evidence that you can sort of get together, the more you can interpret and come up with a clearer and a more balanced answer. And that's really what we do try to do as historians, okay? So, it's a discussion of different historical interpretations, and it's worth 10 marks, okay? And the focus of this is to show that the student recognizes that there are different interpretations of history. Okay, so we really want you guys now to consider that throughout history, interpretations or points of view of how things happened can change. Okay. And this can be a challenging question, but there are handouts available that cover historical interpretations of the module. So if you'd like any of those from myself, please get in touch, okay, via messaging me on the YouTube channel. If you are in my class, please feel free to ask me. If you're a friend of mine on Facebook, heck, send me a message. You won't get hold of me on Twitter because I'm not on that, okay? I'm a little bit too old to understand how that all works. But if we move on, here you will see that on the paper, first and foremost, they will give you an interpretation from the period of the exam you are sitting, okay? So, I'll just take a little swig of tango there. So, for instance, this one will say, historians have made different interpretations about the 100 Flowers campaign. One interpretation is that Mao used the 100 Flowers campaign simply to get the opinion of the Chinese people on his reforms, okay? Now, the question will be basically set to you like this. One interpretation is that Mao used the 100 Flowers campaign simply to get the opinion of the Chinese people on his reforms. How far do you agree with this interpretation? And that is going to be worth the 10 marks. So it's worth having a look at what you have to do. Let's have a look at then they will give you, or before this question comes in, because they do allow you, if you have a look at it, it's mentioned at the top of the sheet, then you have evidence 1, evidence 2, evidence 3, which on a PowerPoint window I couldn't fit in. So if we have a look at evidence 1, thinking that one interpretation is that Mao used the 100 Flowers campaign simply to get the opinion of the Chinese people on his reforms. We'll have a look at evidence 1. Now, this evidence 1 is from the memoirs of a Chinese author who grew up in China in the 1950s. And he says that Mao decided to launch a purge on the people who did not agree with him. He created a devious plan. He said, let 100 flowers bloom. Few guessed that Mao was set in a trap and that he was inviting people to speak out so that he could then use what they said as an excuse to attack them. Mao's targets were intellectuals and the educated, the people most likely to speak up. Okay? Now, that's an interpretation that doesn't agree that Mao was just using it to get the people's opinion. The author of evidence 1 is basically saying it was a devious plan. Okay, so we'll have a look at evidence 2. This evidence is from an interpretation from an author who wrote a biography of Mao in 1999. So Mao seemed curious about what people thought of his plans. The 100 Flowers campaign was not a carefully planned trap. It was not an example of Chairman Mao's cunning. Even he was unsure what the campaign would produce. Let's try it and see what it's like, he said. Now that's agreeing. That's agreeing with that interpretation. So we'll have a look at evidence number 3 and we'll see if that agrees as well. Evidence 3. This evidence is a cartoon about the 100 Flowers campaign, which was published in an American newspaper in the 1950s. And here you can see Mao, I'm assuming sowing seeds, although I can't see it there. But the flowers are blooming, and he is saying, let 1,000 flowers blossom. And what you have here is a communist, member of the Communist Party, coming in with a lawnmower and chopping them down. Okay, so we'll have a look at the answer I've written, and that will probably help us make, we'll give you more of an example of what you need to do. Okay, so I start off by writing, the first piece of evidence does not agree with the interpretation that Mao used the 100 Flowers campaign to simply get the opinion of the Chinese people on his reforms. So I used the question, and I'm saying that this first piece of evidence, it doesn't. The author is writing from personal memories and states that few guessed that Mao was laying a trap. The author calls Mao's plan devious and also states that Mao wanted to attack people who did not agree with him. Although the author does not tell us, they may have been targeted too if they were educated. Mao encouraged violence during other periods of his rule, such as the Cultural Revolution, to get rid of his enemies. Okay? So I just used that source that was given to me. I've added a little bit of my own knowledge in there, okay, to show, yeah, I could kind of agree with that, yeah. So we'll move on. Now, the second piece of evidence is the only one that agrees with the interpretation that Mao used the 100 Flowers campaign to simply get the opinion of the Chinese people on his reforms. The author of this piece was writing Mao's biography in 1999 and defends Mao. This could be because China is still a communist country and the author may not have wanted him to look bad or could have gotten into trouble if he did. Another reason could be that the author is a Maoist and supported the leader of China. Furthermore, the China Communist Party used a lot of propaganda to mislead the Chinese people. It would be very hard to get the truth from the sources of the time. However, I do know that many that spoke out in the 100 Flower campaign were arrested and sent for thought reform. Also, there was more censorship brought in after the campaign. Okay, so I've used my own knowledge there. I've taken part of that evidence too and rewritten, and I've also used the question to rewrite. But at the end then, I've kind of shown, well, yeah, I don't really agree with this, okay? And then finally, for the third piece of evidence, I've written the third piece of evidence supports the interpretation that Mao wanted to purge his opponents through the 100 Flowers campaign. Okay, he wanted to get rid of them through a purge. It is an American cartoon and would not be subjected to censorship, okay? It shows that Mao intended to have those that spoke out eliminated because of the communist worker mowing down the flowers that were blooming. China, and I like it, mowing. I don't know if that was intentional, but I hope it was because I like that pun. But China's relations with America were poor at this time, and this source would have been used for propaganda too. Okay? Overall, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to come in there and I'll say, overall, I would agree with the interpretation that Mao used the 100 Flowers campaign to draw out his opponents and attack them because of Mao's tendency for violence and how he silenced his opposition by means of terror. Perhaps what I should have done there, but again, I was under exam conditions there. I'm hoping that whoever was marking this would understand. I would say I do not agree with the interpretation that Mao simply used the 100 Flower campaign to get opinion about his reforms. Okay, so maybe I've reworded that a bit too much. Keep simple, and that's a good point there. Keep it as simple as you can and just say I do not agree with it. But I'm hoping whoever would mark this would be lenient. Okay, but again, under exam conditions, I'm not saying you mess up, but I'm just saying they have to allow for that, and I'm sure an examiner would. Okay. So hints for question 2C. You need to identify which source or sources support the interpretation which they've already given you. Okay, so you can, as you're reading this, you can give a tick. Yes, that one does, that one doesn't, and that one doesn't. It could be the top two don't and the last one does. It could be the first one does, the second one doesn't, and the last one does. I don't know which mixture it's going to be. And so you need to identify which source support the interpretation that's been given and which source or sources provide alternative interpretations. So it isn't as hard as it first appears. Okay? You're just agreeing that, it's almost like you're matching in pairs, this one, yeah, that one is the same as an interpretation as what I've just read. That one is as well, but this one gives an alternative, a different interpretation, and it really becomes as easy as that. Okay, you need to discuss the content of the sources and their attributions. Okay, so I've done that. I've spoken about the attributes of the authors, saying that well, this author, he might have been targeted, he was working on his memory, and basically, for the second guy, he was writing an autobiography, so he had to be nice to Mao. Okay, China's still a communist country, or maybe he was a Maoist, okay? And I'm kind of giving reasons why these interpretations have been formed, yeah? So, the final bit of advice or hint I'm going to give you is you must provide at the end a clear judgment upon the value of the given interpretation. Okay, so again, come down and say, I do not agree with the interpretation that has been given, or I agree with a different interpretation, but make sure that you say that you are giving a judgment and be clear about that. And you should be fine, okay? I'm hoping that, again, by you guys watching this, if that comes up in the exam, bada bing, bada bo, you're laughing. But as I said, I can't promise that. Anyway, guys, byes, because that's the end of video number 2 for Unit 1, Question 2, China under Mao Zedong from 1949 to 1976. Thanks for listening.